The scream tore through the Black Ridge estate before the sun had even cleared the eastern ridge, and every guard on duty froze mid-step. It was not a scream of danger, it was worse. It was the scream of a grown man breaking. King Alaric Thornwood stood in the doorway of his son's nursery with his hands shaking at his sides, staring at the overturned crib, the scattered toys, and the small boy curled into the corner of the room with his knees pulled to his chest. 3 healers stood frozen near the window, afraid to move closer. He threw the bowl at Nora, one of them whispered. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days, my king." Alaric said nothing. He crossed the room slowly, the way a man crosses a frozen lake, unsure if the ice will hold. He knelt in front of his son. Cale's eyes, gray like his mother's had been, lifted to meet his father's, and for one heartbeat, hope flickered in the king's chest. Then the boy opened his mouth, and the only word that ever came out again slipped free like a wound reopening. "Mama." Alaric's jaw tightened. 3 years. 3 years since Isabel had been taken from them in a raid that still haunted his dreams, and in all that time, his son, heir to the Black Ridge throne, had spoken only that single word. Healers had tried herbs. Pack elders had tried old rituals passed down through generations of alphas. Nothing worked. The boy remained locked inside himself, a small prisoner behind gray eyes that used to sparkle with laughter. "Leave us," Alaric said quietly to the healers, and they filed out without protest, relieved to escape the weight of the room. When the door clicked shut, Alaric sat down on the floor beside his son, something a king was never supposed to do, and simply existed beside him in silence. Cale did not pull away. He did not lean in either. He simply stared at the wall, rocking slightly, his small fingers twisting into the hem of his shirt. "I don't know what to do for you," Alaric admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. No guard would ever hear him speak this way. No enemy would ever see this side of the Alpha King, the side that felt more helpless than any battlefield had ever made him feel. "Your mother would have known. She always knew." The boy did not answer. Of course he didn't. He never did. Except for that one word that cut deeper each time it was spoken, because it meant the boy remembered enough to miss her, but not enough to move forward without her. Later that morning, in the west wing of the estate, Margaret Thornwood paced her private study with a letter clutched in her hand. She was Alaric's younger sister, sharp-tongued and sharper-minded, the kind of woman the pack elders respected more than they liked to admit. She had watched her brother crumble in private for 3 years while maintaining an iron mask in public, and she had watched her nephew slip further away with each passing season. She had made a decision 2 weeks ago that she had not yet told her brother about, because she knew exactly how he would react. A knock came at her door. "Enter," she called. Edmund Cole, the captain of the estate guard, stepped inside, his expression tense. "She has arrived, my lady. The human woman. She is waiting at the north gate." Margaret exhaled slowly and folded the letter into her pocket. "Good. Bring her to my study, not the main hall. My brother is not to know yet. With respect, my lady, if the king discovers a stranger has been brought onto Black Ridge land without his knowledge, there will be consequences. For you, for her. I am aware of the risk, Edmund. I am more afraid of what happens if we do nothing at all." She looked toward the window, toward the direction of the nursery she could not see from here, but felt the weight of regardless. "My nephew is disappearing in front of us, and my brother is too broken himself to see clearly. Someone outside this pack needs to try. Bring her in." 20 minutes later, Elena Voss stood in the doorway of Margaret's study, a small travel bag slung over one shoulder, her brown hair pulled back from a face that looked younger than her 26 years, but carried the steady calm of someone who had spent her whole life around children the world had given up on. "Thank you for coming all this way," Margaret said, rising to greet her. "I know my letter was vague. I could not risk writing more." "You said a child needed help that doctors couldn't give him," Elena said. "That was enough for me to come." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Elena did not flinch under the scrutiny, which told Margaret something important. This was not a woman who scared easily. "There are things you should understand before you meet him," Margaret said, gesturing for Elena to sit. "Things about this pack, about my brother, about what my nephew has lost." Elena sat, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm listening." Margaret took a breath, choosing her words the way one chooses steps across unstable ground. "My brother is the Alpha of Black Ridge. He rules over more territory than any pack in the northern regions, and he rules it well. But 3 years ago his wife was killed in an ambush by a rival pack during what should have been a peaceful trade meeting. My nephew, Cale, was there. He was 2 years old. He saw things no child should see." Elena's expression softened, though she kept her composure. "And since then?" "Since then he has spoken one word. Mama. Nothing else." Not his father's name, not his own name, nothing. The healers here believe he is trapped somewhere inside grief they cannot reach. I believe they are right, but I also believe their methods are wrong. They push him. They demand. My brother, in his own desperation, allows it because he does not know what else to try. And you think I can reach him differently? I have heard of your work with children who suffered great loss, children the healers here would call unreachable. I do not care what methods you use, Miss Voss. I care only that you try something gentler than what has already failed. Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what she was being asked to do. I'll need to meet him without pressure. No expectations placed on him in the first days. Just presence. That can be arranged. Margaret hesitated. There is one more thing you should know. My brother does not yet know you are here. He will not react well to a stranger, especially a human stranger, being placed near his son without his consent. For the first time, a flicker of concern crossed Elena's face. You brought me here without his permission? I brought you here because I love my nephew more than I fear my brother's temper. Alaric is a good man beneath the armor he wears, but grief has made him rigid, and rigid men make poor decisions when it comes to the people they love most. I am asking you to trust me for a short while, until I find the right moment to explain things to him properly. Elena sat with that for a moment, weighing the ethics of it against the image of a small boy locked behind a single word for 3 years. She thought of every child she had worked with before, the ones adults had written off as broken beyond repair, the ones who had eventually found their way back to themselves with nothing more than patience and quiet company. All right, she said finally. But I want to be honest with him from the beginning, even if I cannot be honest with his father yet. Children know when they are being lied to, even young ones, especially young ones. Margaret nodded, relief loosening the tension in her shoulders. Agreed. Edmund will show you to the east wing, near the gardens. Cale is often taken there in the mornings, when the healers believe fresh air might help him. You will have your chance to meet him naturally, without forcing anything. As Elena rose to follow Edmund from the room, Margaret caught her arm gently. Miss Voss, thank you. Whatever happens, thank you for coming. Elena offered a small, steady smile. Let's see if I can help him find his way back first. Save the thanks for later. The East Garden was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Elena walked the stone path slowly, taking in the tall hedges, the fountain that had clearly not been used in some time, and the small wooden bench near a cluster of white flowers, where a young nursemaid sat beside a small boy, who stared at nothing in particular. Cale was smaller than she expected, his dark hair falling messily over his forehead, his gray eyes distant in a way that made her chest ache before she had even said a word to him. He did not look up when she approached. He did not react at all. Elena did not rush toward him. She had learned long ago that rushing toward broken things only made them retreat further. Instead, she settled onto the grass a respectful distance away, close enough to be present, far enough to not intrude, and simply sat. The nursemaid glanced at her with confusion. Are you lost, miss? No, Elena said softly. Just visiting. She did not ask Cale his name. She did not ask him to speak. She simply sat in the quiet with him, watching the same nothing he seemed to be watching, letting the morning stretch on without demand. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, Cale's eyes shifted, just slightly, toward the stranger sitting in the grass. He did not speak. He did not move closer. But for the first time in longer than the nursemaid could remember, his gaze held onto something outside himself, for more than a passing second. Elena noticed. She said nothing about it. She simply let the silence continue, patient as still water, and somewhere far above them, in a window overlooking the garden, King Alaric Thornwood stood watching the stranger sitting near his son, his fists clenched at his sides, unaware yet of who she was or why she had come, only aware that something in his chest had gone very, very still. By midday, word had reached Alaric that an unfamiliar woman had been seen near his son, and the fury that rose in him was immediate and consuming. He did not wait for explanations. He did not send guards ahead to announce him. He walked directly to the East Garden himself, his long strides eating up the stone path, his presence alone enough to make servants scatter from his way. He found her still there, still seated in the grass beside his son, the two of them saying nothing, simply existing in shared quiet beneath the white flowers. For a moment, seeing his son's eyes turned toward another person instead of locked on some middle distance only he could see, Alaric's fury faltered. Then it returned, sharper than before. Who are you? He demanded, his voice carrying the full weight of command. And why are you near my son without my knowledge? Elena rose slowly, unshaken by his tone in a way that surprised him. Most people flinched when he spoke like that. She did not. "My name is Elena Voss. Your sister asked me to come. My sister has no authority to bring strangers onto Blackridge land, let alone near my son." "Then perhaps you should be angry with her," Elena said calmly, "though I'd ask you to save that conversation for later. Right now, your son is watching you, and I don't think he's used to seeing you this upset." Alaric's eyes flicked down. Cale was indeed watching him, his small face unreadable, his fingers twisted tightly in the fabric of his shirt the way they always did when the world felt too loud. Alaric's jaw tightened, and he forced his shoulders to relax, though the effort cost him visibly. "Explain yourself," he said, quieter now. Quickly. Elena studied him for a long moment, the way she studied every parent she met, gauging grief and fear, and the fine line between protection and control. "I work with children who have lost the ability, or the will, to speak after something terrible happens to them. Your sister heard of my work and believed I might help your son. That is the whole truth. I did not come to deceive you, Your Majesty. I simply did not yet have the chance to explain myself before you found me." Alaric said nothing for a long moment, his gaze moving between the stranger and his silent son. Then, almost involuntarily, Cale reached out and grabbed a fistful of Elena's sleeve, the way he had not reached for anyone, not even his own father, in longer than Alaric could bear to remember. The king's breath caught in his throat. "Papa," Cale whispered. It was not the second word Elena would one day hear months from now, the word that would change everything. It was smaller than that, quieter, barely a whisper lost to the wind. But it was new. It was different. It was, for the first time in 3 years, not the name of his mother. Alaric stood frozen, staring at his son as though the ground beneath him had shifted, his fury dissolving into something raw and unguarded that he had not allowed himself to feel in public since the day Isabel died. He looked at Elena, and though his voice remained hard, something in his eyes had already begun to change. "You will stay," he said finally, the words rough, uncertain, a king unaccustomed to admitting he needed help. "For now, until I decide otherwise." Elena nodded once, quietly, and looked down at the small boy still gripping her sleeve, his gray eyes locked on his father's face for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. Something had shifted in the garden that morning, small and fragile, but undeniably real, and none of them yet understood how far that single moment would carry them before the story was through. Word of the stranger's presence spread through Blackridge faster than Alaric could contain it. By evening, servants whispered in hallways, guards exchanged glances at their posts, and the pack elders requested an audience the king had no desire to grant. He sat at the head of the long table in the war room that night, listening to old voices argue about tradition and bloodlines and the danger of allowing outsiders near an heir, and he felt every word land like a blow he was too tired to block. "A human woman," Elder Garrick said, his voice thick with disapproval, "caring for the future alpha of Blackridge. Have you considered what this looks like to our neighbors, to the packs already circling for weakness?" "I have considered nothing else since this morning," Alaric said evenly, though his patience had worn thin hours ago. "What I have not heard from any of you is a better solution. My son has not spoken a full sentence in 3 years. Your healers have tried everything within their power. If a stranger's presence brings my son one step closer to speaking again, I will endure the whispers." The room fell silent, though not from agreement. Ulrich could feel the disapproval hanging heavy in the air, but he had long ago learned that silence from his council did not mean surrender. It only meant they would wait for a better moment to strike. Elsewhere in the estate, Elena had been given a small room near the nursery, sparse but comfortable, and she used her first evening at Blackridge not to rest but to observe. She sat outside Cale's door, listening as the boy's evening routine unfolded, noting how the healers spoke to him in clipped instructional tones, how they measured his silence like a failing grade rather than a wound still healing. When the healers finally left for the night, Elena knocked softly and stepped inside. Cale sat on his bed, knees drawn to his chest, staring at the wall the way he always did. She did not turn on the brighter lamp. She left the small candle burning instead, and she sat on the floor near his bed rather than looming over him from a chair. "I'm not going to ask you to talk to me," she said quietly. "I just thought you might not want to be alone right now." Cale did not look at her, but he did not ask her to leave either. Elena took that as permission enough, and she stayed until his breathing slowed into sleep, at which point she quietly slipped from the room, unaware that Alaric had been standing in the shadowed hallway the entire time, watching through the cracked door, his chest tight with something he refused to name. The following days fell into a careful rhythm. Elena spent her mornings in the garden with Cale, her afternoons observing his healer's sessions with careful, quiet corrections, and her evenings simply present in his room until sleep claimed him. She never pushed him to speak. She never celebrated too loudly when he responded, even slightly, to something she said. She treated each small movement, each flicker of attention, as ordinary rather than miraculous, and slowly, so slowly that even she almost missed it, Cale began to lean toward her instead of away. It was Nora, the head healer, who first grew frustrated with the change in approach. She cornered Elena outside the nursery on the fourth morning, her arms crossed, her expression sharp with the particular resentment of someone who had dedicated years to a problem only to watch a stranger arrive and shift the ground beneath her feet. "You let him wander during lessons," Nora said. "You let him ignore the exercises we have spent months building. This is not healing, Miss Voss. This is indulgence." "With respect," Elena said, keeping her voice level. "The exercises you have spent months building have produced no change in 3 years. I'm not indulging him. I'm giving him room to feel safe enough to try again on his own terms. He is the heir to Blackridge. He does not have the luxury of healing at his own pace." "He is a child," Elena said, quieter now, though there was steel beneath the softness. "And children who are forced to heal on someone else's timeline usually don't heal at all. They just learn to hide better." Nora's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, turning instead and walking briskly down the corridor, her footsteps sharp against the stone floor. Elena watched her go, aware that she had made an enemy within the walls of Blackridge, and aware, too, that enemies within these walls carried more weight than they might elsewhere. That evening, Alaric found Elena in the garden long after Cale had been put to bed, sitting alone beneath the same white flowers where he had first found her. He approached slowly this time, without the fury that had driven him toward her on the first day, though caution still colored every step. "Nora tells me you've undone months of her methods," he said, sitting on the edge of the fountain across from her. "Nora's methods were built on the idea that grief follows a schedule," Elena replied. "It doesn't, not for adults, and certainly not for children." Alaric studied her in the dim evening light, the way one studies something unfamiliar and slightly unsettling. "You speak to me as though I don't already understand grief has no schedule." Something in his tone caught her attention, quiet and raw beneath the composed exterior he wore like armor. "Do you?" she asked carefully. "Understand that, I mean, truly." He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost some of its usual command. "I understand that I buried my wife 3 years ago, and some mornings I still expect to hear her voice in the hallway before I remember she is gone. I understand grief has no schedule for me either, Miss Voss. I simply do not have the luxury of showing it." Elena said nothing for a moment, letting the honesty of his words settle between them without rushing to fill the silence with false comfort. "Your son doesn't need you to hide it," she said finally. "He needs to see that it's survivable. That's part of what I'm trying to teach him, in my own way. That feeling something enormous doesn't mean you disappear inside it forever." Alaric's eyes flickered toward the nursery window, dark now, his son asleep somewhere behind it. "And if he never finds his way back? If the boy who once laughed in that garden is gone for good? Then we keep showing up anyway," Elena said simply. "Because giving up on him is the only thing that would guarantee it." Alaric said nothing more that night, but he did not leave the garden immediately either. He sat across from her in silence, the two of them beneath the same stars that had once watched Isabel laugh in this very spot, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence between two people did not feel like a wound. It felt, faintly, like the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name. The weeks that followed brought small, fragile progress that no one dared speak of too loudly, as though naming it might scare it away. Cale began drawing again, rough shapes at first, then recognizable ones. Small houses and animals, and once, startlingly, a picture of 2 figures standing beneath a tree, one large and one small, holding hands. Elena kept that drawing without telling anyone, tucked carefully into her bag, a private proof that something inside the boy was stirring back to life. He began humming too, quiet fragments of melody that Elena recognized after the third occurrence as a lullaby, though she never learned where he had first heard it. She hummed it back to him once, softly, and watched his small shoulders relax in a way she had not seen before. He did not speak, but something in him was listening again, reaching again, however faintly, toward the world beyond his own silence. Alaric noticed the changes too, though he said little about them directly. He began finding reasons to pass by the garden in the mornings, reasons to linger near the nursery in the evenings, always at a respectful distance, always watching his son with the desperate hunger of a man who had spent 3 years starving for exactly this. He noticed, too, the way Elena never claimed credit for the small victories, never treated them as her own success, always turning the conversation back to Cale himself, to what the boy might need next, rather than what progress had already been made. It was during this fragile, hopeful stretch that the first real threat arrived, carried not by an army, but by a single letter, delivered to the war room under a seal, Alaric recognized immediately and hated on sight. The sender was Daemon Ashford, Alpha of the Ashford Pack, a rival territory to the east that had never fully accepted Blackridge's dominance over the northern trade routes, and whose ambition had only grown sharper in the years since Isabel's death, an event some still whispered his own hand had played a part in, though nothing had ever been proven. The letter was polite on its surface, an invitation to a gathering of northern alphas meant to discuss shifting trade boundaries, but buried within its careful diplomatic language was a clear challenge, an implication that Blackridge's leadership had grown distracted, weakened by a broken heir, and a king too consumed by grief to properly guard his territory. Alaric read the letter twice before setting it down on the table, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know him well enough to see the tension gathering behind his eyes. "He is testing you," Margaret said, standing across the table with her arms crossed. She had read the letter over his shoulder, and her expression carried none of the careful diplomacy the letter itself pretended toward. "Daemon has wanted a piece of our territory since before Isabel died. This is simply the first time he has felt confident enough to say so openly." "He mentions Cale," Alaric said quietly, tapping a finger against the parchment. "Indirectly, but clearly enough. He knows about Elena. He knows my son still cannot speak properly. Someone within these walls has been talking." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Nora," she said, though it was more accusation than question. "Perhaps. Or one of the elders who disapproves of Elena's presence here. It hardly matters which mouth carried the words. What matters is that our enemies now see an opening, and I cannot afford to let them believe it is as wide as they think." "What will you do?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the direction of the garden where, even now, he knew Elena was likely sitting with his son in the fading afternoon light, patient as still water, asking nothing of the boy but presence. He thought of the drawing Elena had shown him 2 nights before, hesitant to share it at first, the small figure holding a larger figure's hand beneath a crude tree. He thought of the humming he had heard drifting from the nursery, faint and imperfect and utterly precious. "I will attend the gathering," he said finally. "I will show Daemon Ashford and every other alpha in the north that Blackridge remains exactly as strong as it has always been, but I will not remove Elena from my son's life to prove it. Whatever weakness they believe they see in me, I would rather be accused of weakness than lose the only progress my son has made in 3 years." Margaret studied her brother for a long moment, something like quiet pride flickering behind her usual sharpness. "You've changed since she arrived," she said softly, "even if you won't admit it yet." Alaric said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw tightened, and he turned back toward the window, toward the garden, toward the fragile hope he was only beginning to allow himself to feel. That evening, storm clouds gathered heavy over the Blackridge estate, and Elena found herself walking the halls long after Cale had fallen asleep, restless with an unease she could not quite name. She passed the war room and paused at the sound of raised voices within, low enough to be private but sharp enough to carry through the heavy door. "You cannot keep protecting her, simply because your son has grown attached," Nora's voice insisted from within. "The elders are asking questions. The Ashford Pack is asking questions. Every day she remains here is another day Blackridge looks divided from within." "My son spoke his father's name for the first time in 3 years, the same week she arrived," Alaric's voice replied, low and controlled, but carrying an edge of warning beneath it. "I will not discuss removing her again, Nora. This conversation is finished." Elena stepped back from the door quietly, her heart pounding with something between gratitude and fear. She had known, distantly, that her presence created friction within the pack's careful order, but hearing the shape of that friction laid bare, made it suddenly, uncomfortably real. She returned to her room that night unsettled, aware that the fragile peace surrounding Cale's healing existed within walls far more precarious than she had first understood, and that the storm gathering outside the estate was nothing compared to the one quietly building within it. The gathering of Northern Alphas took place a week later, held on neutral ground at the border between Blackridge and Ashford territory, a wide clearing surrounded by ancient trees that had witnessed more pack conflicts than any living memory could recall. Alaric arrived with Edmund Cole at his side, and a small contingent of guards, his expression composed into the same unreadable mask he had worn since the day he first took the throne. Damon Ashford greeted him with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing harmless, while quietly building towards something far more dangerous. He was tall, golden-haired, with the kind of easy charm that made lesser alphas underestimate the ambition simmering beneath it. "Alaric," Damon said, extending a hand that Alaric shook without warmth. "It has been too long. I trust your household remains as strong as ever." "Stronger than you might hope," Alaric replied evenly, and something flickered behind Damon's eyes, quick and calculating, gone before anyone else might have noticed it. The gathering proceeded through the usual formalities, trade boundaries discussed, hunting territories reaffirmed, old grievances aired and set carefully aside for the sake of temporary peace. But Alaric felt the undercurrent the entire time, the careful way certain alphas watched him, gauging whether the rumors of his distracted leadership held any truth. He answered every question directly, negotiated every point without hesitation, and by the gathering's end, he had given his rivals nothing they could use against him, though he had also given himself no illusions about how quickly that could change. As the gathering dispersed, Damon fell into step beside him, his voice dropping low enough that only Alaric could hear. "I hear your son has found comfort in an unusual companion," he said, feigning casual interest. "A human, no less. How progressive of Blackridge." Alaric's stride did not falter, though his voice hardened. "My son's well-being is not a subject open for your commentary, Damon." "Of course not," Damon said smoothly, though his smile carried something sharper beneath its surface. "I only mention it because weakness, even well-intentioned weakness, has a way of inviting attention from those who might exploit it. I would hate to see Blackridge suffer for choices made in grief rather than strength." "Is that a threat?" "It's a friendly observation, nothing more," Damon said, though the warning in his tone was unmistakable. "Take care of your household, Alaric. The North is watching closely these days, and not everyone watching wishes you well." Alaric said nothing further, but the words settled into his chest like a stone as he rode back toward Blackridge that evening, the storm clouds from the previous night finally breaking into a steady rain that soaked through his cloak long before he reached the estate gates. He thought of Cale's small drawing, the figures holding hands beneath a crude tree. He thought of Elena's steady voice insisting that giving up guaranteed nothing but loss. And he thought, with a clarity that unsettled him more than any threat Damon Ashford could offer, that he was no longer entirely certain which battle mattered more, the one waiting for him in the war room, or the quiet one unfolding each morning in the garden where his son was slowly, carefully, learning to hope again. He returned to find the estate quiet, most of the household already retired for the night, but light still glowed faintly from beneath the nursery door. He climbed the stairs slowly, rain still dripping from his cloak, and found Elena seated on the floor beside Cale's bed, the boy fast asleep, one small hand still curled loosely around the sleeve of her shirt even in sleep. She looked up when he entered, reading something in his expression that told her the gathering had not gone as smoothly as hoped. "What happened?" she asked quietly, careful not to wake the boy. Alaric hesitated at the doorway, torn between the instinct to protect her from the weight of what he had heard, and the growing recognition that shielding her from the truth would serve no one, least of all his son. "Damon Ashford believes Blackridge has grown weak," he said finally, his voice low. "He believes my son's condition, and your presence here, are signs of a king distracted from his duties." Elena's expression tightened, though she did not look away. "And what do you believe?" Alaric stepped further into the room, his gaze falling to his sleeping son, to the small hand still gripping Elena's sleeve, to the drawing propped on the nightstand of two figures holding hands beneath a crude tree, which he had not seen until this very moment. "I believe," he said quietly, "that for the first time in 3 years, my son fell asleep holding on to something other than grief. I believe that matters more than anything Damon Ashford has to say." He paused, his jaw tightening as though the next words cost him something significant to speak aloud. "But I also believe the danger is real, and I will not pretend otherwise. Whatever comes next, Elena, I need you to understand that your presence here has consequences beyond this room." Elena held his gaze steadily, unafraid, though the weight of his words settled heavy between them. "I understood that the moment I agreed to come," she said. "I'm not leaving him now, not when he's finally starting to find his way back." Something in Alaric's chest loosened at her words, relief and fear tangled together in equal measure, and he found himself, for the first time since Isabel's death, uncertain whether the greatest danger facing Blackridge lived beyond its borders, or within the fragile, unspoken thing quietly growing between himself and the woman kneeling beside his son's bed. The days following the gathering carried a tension that settled over the estate like fog that refused to lift. Guards doubled their patrols along the eastern border. Margaret spent long hours locked in correspondence with allied pacts, gauging where loyalties truly stood should tensions with Ashford escalate further. And within the nursery, unaware of the storm gathering around him, Cale continued his slow, quiet journey back toward the world, drawing more pictures, humming more fragments of melody, reaching for Elena's hand each morning as though it were the most natural thing in existence. It was on a quiet afternoon, 3 weeks after the gathering, that the fragile peace within the nursery cracked wide open, though not from any external threat. Nora arrived unannounced during one of Elena's garden sessions, flanked by 2 junior healers, her expression set with the particular determination of someone who believed she was acting in the child's best interest, however misguided that belief might be. "The council has authorized new methods," Nora announced, her voice clipped and formal. "Given the urgency of recent political pressures, we can no longer afford to wait indefinitely for gentle progress. The king has agreed to more direct intervention." Elena rose immediately, positioning herself slightly between Nora and the boy still seated in the grass. "What kind of intervention?" "Structured exposure sessions," Nora said, gesturing for the junior healers to step forward. "Controlled social situations designed to encourage verbal response through necessity rather than comfort. It has shown results in similar cases within other pacts. Forcing a response is not the same as healing," Elena said sharply, her calm composure cracking for the first time since her arrival at Blackridge. "You cannot frighten a child into speaking again. With respect, Miss Voss, your methods have produced small comforts, but no true breakthrough. The king requires results, not incremental gestures." Elena's stomach tightened with something between anger and betrayal. "The king agreed to this?" Nora's silence was answer enough, and Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, uncertain now whether the fragile trust she believed she had built with Alaric had been an illusion all along, or whether pressure from the north had finally worn down his resolve to protect his son's healing at any cost. Cale, sensing the tension surrounding him, had gone rigid in the grass, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears, his breathing quickening in a way Elena recognized immediately as the beginning of overwhelming distress. She knelt beside him instantly, blocking his view of the approaching healers, her voice low and steady despite the storm rising in her chest. "You're safe," she murmured to him. "I'm right here. Nothing is going to happen that you don't want to happen." But even as she spoke the words, she was no longer certain they were true, and the uncertainty in her own voice frightened her more than anything Damon Ashford's threats had managed to accomplish. She found Alaric an hour later in the war room, Cale finally calmed and resting under Margaret's careful watch, and the frustration she carried into the room was unlike anything she had allowed herself to show since arriving at Blackridge. "You authorized this," she said before he had even fully turned to face her. "After everything we've built these past weeks, you authorized pushing him into situations designed to unsettle a response out of him." Alaric's expression was tight, exhausted in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure from every direction. "The elders believe the political situation requires visible progress, Elena. Damon Ashford is not the only alpha questioning Blackridge's stability. I cannot ignore the council's demands indefinitely, not when the safety of this entire pack may depend on projecting strength." "Your son's well-being should not be a bargaining chip in a political game," Elena said, her voice shaking now with a frustration she rarely allowed herself to show. "I understood that the danger outside these walls was real. I did not understand that you would let it change how you protect the healing already taking root inside your own son." Alaric's jaw tightened, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like regret, though his voice remained firm when he spoke. "I am trying to protect everyone I am responsible for, Elena. That includes my son, but it also includes every family within these walls who depends on Blackridge remaining strong enough to keep them safe. You do not carry that weight. I do." "No," Elena said quietly, though there was no softness left in her tone. "I only carry the weight of watching a child I have grown to care for go rigid with distress, because the adults around him decided pressure was an acceptable price for progress. If that is the path you've chosen, then perhaps you no longer need me here at all." She turned and left before he could respond, and Alaric stood alone in the war room long after her footsteps had faded, staring at the empty doorway, the weight of every choice he had made in the past 3 years pressing down on him with a force he had not allowed himself to feel since the day he buried his wife. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after the candles burned low, turning Elena's words over in his mind until they wore grooves into his thoughts. He thought of Isabel, of the way she used to say that strength without gentleness was just another kind of fear wearing armor. He thought of Cale's small hands pressed over his ears in the garden, of the rigid terror Nora's methods had produced in a single afternoon after weeks of careful, patient progress. And he thought, with a clarity that shamed him, that he had let the noise of the council drown out the one voice in this entire estate who had actually managed to reach his son. He found Elena just before dawn, not in her room but in the garden itself, seated on the same bench where she had first appeared, wrapped in a shawl against the early chill, unable to sleep for reasons that mirrored his own. She did not look up when he approached, though she knew his footsteps by now, steady and deliberate, unmistakably his. "I cancelled the council's new methods an hour ago," he said, standing a respectful distance away. "Nora will not approach my son again without both our agreement. I should have said that the moment you brought your concerns to me, not after a full night of arguing with myself about it." Elena finally looked up at him, searching his face in the pale gray light before sunrise. Why the change? Alaric was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the careful command he usually wore like a second skin. "Because you were right, and because I think some part of me already knew it before you said the words aloud. I have spent 3 years telling myself that strength meant never allowing weakness to show, not in my son, and certainly not in myself. I built the same demand into every method the healers tried, without ever questioning whether the demand itself was the problem." He sat down on the far end of the bench, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to leave her the space she had earned. "The day Isabel died," he said, and his voice caught slightly on her name, an admission of its own. "I was 3 miles away, meeting with a delegation that turned out to matter far less than I believed at the time. I have spent 3 years telling myself that if I had simply been present, things might have gone differently. That guilt has shaped every decision I've made since, Elena. I built walls around myself and called it leadership. I built the same walls around my son and called it protection. I did not realize how much those walls were also keeping him locked inside his own silence until you arrived and refused to build any yourself." Elena's expression softened, the anger from the previous evening giving way to something gentler, though no less honest. "You couldn't have known what would happen that day," she said quietly. "Grief likes to rewrite history so that we're always the villain in it. But punishing yourself for 3 years hasn't brought her back, and it hasn't helped Kale either. It's only kept both of you frozen in the same moment, unable to move forward." "I know that," Alaric admitted, the words costing him something visible in the set of his shoulders. "I have known it for some time, if I'm honest. I simply did not know how to stop, until I watched you sit with my son in this same garden and ask nothing of him at all. You gave him room to grieve, without demanding he perform recovery on anyone else's timeline. I have never known how to offer that to him, or to myself." The first light of dawn began creeping over the eastern hedges, painting the white flowers pale gold, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them entirely unlike the silence that had defined the estate for 3 long years. This silence held something neither of them wanted to disturb. "Thank you," Elena said finally, "for canceling the sessions, and for telling me this. I know it wasn't easy." "Very little has been easy since Isabel died," Alaric said, a faint, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time in longer than he could remember. "But this morning feels less difficult than most. I'm not entirely certain why." Elena said nothing, though something warm and cautious passed between them in the growing light, an understanding neither was ready to name, but both recognized as real. The weeks that followed brought a new steadiness to the estate. With the council's aggressive methods set aside, Elena resumed her patient work with Kale, and Alaric began joining them more often in the garden. Awkward at first, uncertain how to simply exist beside his son without demanding progress, but improving with each quiet morning. Kale began reaching for his father's hand as readily as he reached for Elena's, and though he still spoke only the rare, whispered word, the fear that had gripped him during Nora's intervention slowly faded, replaced by something closer to trust. Margaret watched the change in her brother with quiet satisfaction, though she said little about it directly, wary of disturbing something so fragile with too much attention. Nora, for her part, kept her distance, though her disapproval simmered beneath the surface, a quiet resentment that would not fully disappear even as Kale's progress became impossible to deny. Damon Ashford's letters continued to arrive with unsettling regularity, each one wrapped in polite language that barely concealed the ambition beneath it, testing Blackridge's borders and patience in equal measure. Alaric answered each one carefully, firmly, refusing to give ground, though the tension along the eastern border never fully eased. A storm held at bay rather than dispersed entirely. It was on an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way that should have made it forgettable, that everything finally changed. Elena had spent the day with Kale as she always did, drawing pictures and humming half-remembered melodies, and as evening fell, She rose to leave his room the way she had every night for months, expecting nothing different from any evening before it. "Good night, Cale," she said softly, pausing at the door the way she always did, giving him the same quiet moment of transition she offered every night. Cale looked up from his bed, his gray eyes catching the lamplight, and for a long moment he simply watched her, the way he had learned to watch the world again these past months, careful and searching. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, so quiet Elena almost missed it entirely, he spoke. "Stay." Elena froze in the doorway, her heart catching in her chest. It was not the single word he had spoken for 3 years, worn smooth with grief and repetition. It was new, deliberate, aimed directly at her, carrying a weight that startled her more than she had expected any single syllable could. "Cale," she whispered, turning back toward him slowly, careful not to frighten the moment away. "Did you just stay?" he said again, more clearly this time, his small hand reaching out from beneath the blanket toward her. Elena crossed the room in 3 quick steps and knelt beside his bed, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes as she took his outstretched hand. "I'm staying," she said softly. "I'm right here, Cale. I'm not going anywhere." Outside the door, having come to check on his son one final time before retiring for the night, Alaric stood frozen, having heard every word through the gap in the doorway. His chest tightened with an emotion too large to name, relief and joy and something achingly tender all tangled together, and when he finally stepped into the room, Cale turned to look at him too, his small face open in a way it had not been in 3 years. "Papa," the boy said, and then, turning back to Elena with the same fragile wonder, "Stay." Alaric crossed the room slowly, kneeling on the opposite side of the bed from Elena, and for the first time since Isabel's death, he allowed the tears he had held back for 3 years to fall freely in front of another person, unashamed, unguarded, present in a way he had forgotten how to be. "We're both staying," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for as long as you need us." Cale's small fingers curled around both their hands, one in each of his, and in the quiet lamplight of the nursery, something that had been broken for 3 long years began, at last, to mend. News of Cale's second word spread through Blackridge by morning, carried first by a joyful Margaret who could not contain her relief, then by servants who had watched the small heir suffer in silence for so long that many had quietly given up hope of ever hearing him speak freely again. Even Nora, standing at the edge of the nursery that morning and watching Cale point at his breakfast and murmur a soft request for more, found herself blinking back unexpected tears, her disapproval finally giving way to something like humility. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly to Elena later that day, the words clearly difficult for a woman unaccustomed to conceding ground. "I believed urgency was the same as care. I see now they are not always the same thing." Elena accepted the admission graciously, understanding that pride yielding to truth was its own kind of courage. "You wanted to help him," she said. "That was never in question. We simply disagreed about the path." Word of the breakthrough eventually reached even the northern packs, carried along trade routes and whispered between messengers, and when it reached Damon Ashford, he received it with far less triumph than he might have expected only weeks before. A king whose son was healing, whose household stood united rather than divided, was a far less appealing target than the fractured leadership he had hoped to exploit. His letters grew less frequent in the months that followed, his ambitions quietly redirected toward territories that offered easier openings, and though the rivalry between Ashford and Blackridge never fully dissolved, the immediate danger that had shadowed Cale's healing began to recede into the background of estate life rather than looming over every decision. Cale's recovery did not happen overnight, and no one who had watched his 3 years of silence expected it to. New words arrived slowly, carefully, each one a small victory celebrated quietly, rather than with the fanfare that might frighten him back into silence. He learned to say Elena's name fully, no longer simply reaching for her but calling for her by name across the garden, delighted each time by the way it made her smile. He learned to say more than single words eventually, small sentences that grew steadier with each passing month, until the boy who had once rocked silently in the corner of his nursery became, gradually, unmistakably, a child again, curious, and occasionally mischievous, prone to laughter that echoed through the halls in a way the estate had not heard since Isabel was alive. Alaric changed alongside his son, the rigid armor he had worn since his wife's death softening in ways the pack elders noticed with a mixture of concern and, eventually, quiet approval. He began attending council meetings with more patience, listening rather than simply commanding, and though his authority never wavered, something gentler had woven itself into the way he led. He credited none of this openly to Elena, though everyone within the estate understood the truth well enough without him needing to say it. Their relationship deepened slowly, the way trust often does after loss has taught two people to be careful with hope. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden turning point beyond the one that had already reshaped their lives in the nursery that quiet evening. Instead, there were small moments accumulating steadily into something neither of them had expected to find again. Shared mornings in the garden, evenings spent talking long after Cale had fallen asleep, a growing understanding that they had each, in their own way, helped the other find their way back from grief that had once seemed permanent. Margaret, watching her brother laugh freely for the first time in years during a quiet family dinner one evening, caught Elena's eye across the table and offered a small, knowing smile. Neither of them said anything about it, though both understood exactly what the moment meant. A year after Elena's arrival, on a bright spring morning much like the one that had first brought her to Blackridge, Cale ran through the garden chasing a small dog that had recently joined the estate's growing household, his laughter bright and unguarded, echoing off the stone walls that had once witnessed nothing but silence. Alaric and Elena watched from the same bench where they had first spoken honestly to one another, close enough now that their shoulders touched, comfortable in a way that required no explanation. "He asked me yesterday if I would teach him to swim this summer," Elena said, watching Cale tumble happily into the grass, the dog barking joyfully beside him. A full sentence. He barely paused to think about the words anymore. "He asked me the same thing this morning," Alaric said, a warmth in his voice that had become as natural to him now as breathing. "I told him his teacher already had plans to be there." Elena laughed softly, leaning slightly into his shoulder, and Alaric wrapped an arm around her without hesitation, the gesture as easy now as it had once been unthinkable. Somewhere in the garden, Cale looked up and saw them together, and rather than the confusion or distress such moments might once have caused him, he simply grinned and ran closer, throwing himself onto the bench between them with the easy confidence of a child who had finally, fully, come home to himself. "Papa," he said happily. "Elena, watch me." He darted off again before either could answer, and they watched him go. This small boy who had once spoken only one grief-worn word for 3 long years, now running freely through a garden full of sunlight, surrounded by people who had chosen, again and again, not to give up on him. Alaric turned to look at Elena, the woman who had arrived as a stranger and become, gradually, and without either of them fully noticing the moment it happened, something far more permanent in both their lives. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying." Elena smiled, watching Cale tumble happily in the grass ahead of them, the word that had once broken, and then healed all three of them settling comfortably now into the ordinary rhythm of their lives together. "Always," she said. "For as long as you both need me." And in the golden light of that spring morning, with laughter ringing bright through a garden that had once known only silence, the broken pieces of a family finally, fully, found their way home.